In the early hours of June 22, 1941, 3 million German soldiers stood at the edge of the Soviet border and waited for the order that would change the world. Behind them stretched the greatest invasion force ever assembled in human history. Before them lay a country so vast it could swallow every nation Germany had already conquered and still have room to spare. The men had been told it would be over in 8 weeks. Their generals had been told the same. Even Hitler himself, staring at maps in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, believed that one hard kick would bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. What followed instead was the single greatest military catastrophe in the history of warfare, and the moment that sealed the fate of the Third Reich. Not in 1944 when the Allies landed at Normandy, not in 1943 when the tide turned at Stalingrad, but here, on this morning, with this decision, made by one man who had been right so many times before that nobody around him dared to tell him he was wrong. Now, let us go back to the beginning of this story, because to understand why Barbarossa was the mistake that cost Hitler the war, you first need to understand why he thought it would work. By the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler had achieved something that no European leader since Napoleon had managed. He had conquered the continent. Poland had fallen in 5 weeks, Denmark and Norway in 2 months. Then France, the great power that had bled Germany white in the First World War. The country that German soldiers had spent 4 years failing to crack from 1914 to 1918 had collapsed in just 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had been chased into the sea at Dunkirk. The Low Countries were occupied. Yugoslavia and Greece had been crushed in April 1941. By June of that year, the only power still fighting Germany in Europe was Britain, which sat behind its channel and its navy and refused to negotiate. Hitler's empire stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the outskirts of Warsaw. He was, by almost every measure available to him, the most successful military commander since Napoleon. And, like Napoleon, he turned east. The decision to invade the Soviet Union had been in Hitler's mind long before the war began. He had written about it in Mein Kampf in 1925. He had told his generals about it in 1937. It was not an improvised reaction to circumstances. It was the ideological core of everything he believed. In Hitler's worldview, Germany needed living space, Lebensraum, vast territories in the east where German settlers could farm and build and expand the Reich for generations. Those territories were held by what he considered an inferior race, the Slavic peoples of Russia and Eastern Europe, governed by what he considered a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy centered in Moscow. The destruction of the Soviet Union was not merely a military objective. It was the fulfillment of everything he had always said he would do. In that sense, Barbarossa was the most honest act of Hitler's political career. He had promised this war for 16 years, and now he was going to fight it. The German military plan, finalized through the autumn and winter of 1940 and into early 1941, was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its confidence. 3 massive army groups would strike simultaneously across a front nearly 2,000 kilometers wide. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, would drive through the Baltic states toward Leningrad, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution. Army Group Center, the strongest of the 3, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, would crash through Belorussia and drive directly toward Moscow. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would sweep through Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, capturing its agricultural wealth and its industrial base. The entire campaign, according to the planners, would be completed within 8 to 10 weeks. The Red Army would be encircled, destroyed, and scattered before the autumn rains turned the Russian roads to mud. Germany would then sit behind a defensive line running roughly from Archangel in the north to Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea, a line the planners called the AA line, and the war in the east would be over. It was not a stupid plan. It was, in many ways, a brilliant plan. The problem was that it rested on a set of assumptions, and every one of those assumptions was wrong. The first assumption was about the Red Army. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, had spent years studying Soviet forces and had concluded that they were badly led, poorly equipped, and fundamentally fragile. This was not entirely without foundation. In 1937 and 1938, Stalin had conducted one of the most catastrophic acts of military self-destruction in history. In his paranoid conviction that the army was plotting against him, he had arrested, imprisoned, and shot the senior officer corps of the Red Army. 3 of 5 marshals were killed. 13 of 15 army commanders were killed. 50 of 57 corps commanders were killed. The officer ranks down to colonel level had been gutted. The army that remained was commanded by men who had been promoted far beyond their experience, who were terrified of taking initiative, and who had been trained, above all, never to bring bad news to their superiors. The Finnish Winter War of 1939 to 1940, in which the Red Army had spent 3 months and hundreds of thousands of casualties to defeat a country of 4 million people, had seemed to confirm every German judgment about Soviet military incompetence. Hitler had watched the Finnish War and concluded that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay. What he did not see, or refused to see, was that the Red Army had looked at the Finnish War too, and had begun to change. New commanders were being promoted on merit rather than political loyalty. New equipment was coming out of the Soviet factories at a rate that German intelligence had badly underestimated. The T-34 tank, which would prove superior to almost everything Germany fielded for the first 2 years of the Eastern War, was already rolling off Soviet production lines in significant numbers. The Soviet Union was not the broken giant that Hitler imagined. It was a wounded giant that was beginning, slowly and painfully, to heal itself. Germany was about to kick it very hard before the healing was complete, and even that might not be enough. The second assumption was about Soviet geography. The German planners knew that Russia was large. What they failed to fully reckon with was what that largeness meant in military terms. Every westward step the German army took in France brought them closer to Paris, closer to London, closer to final victory. Every eastward step into Russia brought them further from their supply bases, further from their repair shops, further from their reinforcements, and deeper into a country where the roads were dirt tracks that dissolved in rain, and the rail gauge was different from the European standard, meaning that every captured Soviet railway line had to be physically rebuilt before it could carry German trains. The Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, was a modern army in many of its strike elements, but was fundamentally dependent on horses and carts for its logistical tail. It had 750,000 horses at the start of Barbarossa. It would need far more than that, and it would lose them at a rate that no planning document had anticipated. The third assumption was about time. 8 to 10 weeks was the estimate. It had to be, because Germany did not have the industrial base to fight a prolonged war against the Soviet Union. The entire strategy depended on a knockout blow, a rapid collapse of Soviet organized resistance, a negotiated peace, or a total disintegration of the Soviet state. If the campaign lasted beyond the autumn, Germany would be fighting through a Russian winter with summer uniforms and summer equipment stretched across supply lines that were already strained to breaking point against an enemy that had not collapsed and that was receiving American material support through the Lend-Lease program that President Roosevelt had put in place in March 1941. Hitler's Germany was not equipped economically or militarily, for a war of attrition against the largest country on earth. The entire bet was on speed, and speed in Russia was not something that could be guaranteed. At 3:15 in the morning of June 22, 1941, German artillery opened fire along the entire front. The noise was described by soldiers on both sides as a physical force, a wall of sound that seemed to push the air itself. Moments later, the first German units crossed the border. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The opening days were catastrophic for the Soviet Union in a way that is still staggering to contemplate. The Red Army was caught almost completely off guard. Stalin had received warnings, dozens of them, from his own intelligence services, from British intelligence, from a German deserter who had crossed the lines the night before the attack and told a Soviet patrol the exact time the offensive would begin. Stalin had dismissed every warning. He was convinced that Hitler would not attack while Britain remained undefeated. He believed, with the peculiar stubbornness of a man who had survived by never being wrong, that the reports were provocations designed to drag the Soviet Union into a premature war. When German bombs began falling on Soviet cities in the first hours of the attack, the Soviet High Command issued orders that the border troops were not to return fire without specific authorization. Soviet aircraft were caught on the ground at their airfields, neatly lined up in rows, and destroyed in their hundreds within the first hours. The Soviet Air Force lost more than 1,000 planes on the first day. By the end of the first week, it had lost nearly 4,000. The armored spearheads of Army Group Center, the twin panzer groups commanded by Generals Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, drove forward at speeds that seemed impossible. They wheeled around each other in great encircling movements, trapping entire Soviet armies in vast pockets. At Bialystok and Minsk in late June, they encircled and destroyed 3 Soviet armies, taking more than 300,000 prisoners. At Smolensk in July and August, they trapped another 300,000. The numbers were staggering. By the end of the summer campaign, the Wehrmacht had taken more prisoners than the entire pre-war strength of the Red Army. They had destroyed or captured thousands of Soviet tanks and aircraft. By any historical measure, the German advance was the most successful military offensive ever executed. And it was not enough, because for every Soviet army that was destroyed, another appeared. The Soviet Union had a population of nearly 200 million people. It had industrial plants behind the Ural Mountains that German bombers could not reach. It had a political system that, for all its brutality and incompetence, was capable of mobilizing human and material resources on a scale that Germany could not match. And it had Stalin, who had recovered from the shock of the first days and who, unlike the Kaiser in 1918 or the French government in 1940, was not going to ask for terms. He was going to fight. On July the 3rd, 11 days after the invasion began, Stalin addressed the Soviet people for the first time in a radio broadcast. He called them his brothers and sisters. He told them that the country faced mortal danger. He called for a war of national survival, a scorched earth policy, partisan warfare behind the lines, and total resistance. It was the most important speech he ever made. The Soviet Union would not break. Now here is where the single most consequential decision of the entire Eastern War was made. And it happened not at the start of the campaign, but in the middle of it, at a moment when the outcome still seemed like it might go either way. By mid-July 1941, Army Group Center had reached Smolensk and was poised for the final drive on Moscow. Guderian's and Hoth's panzer groups were exhausted but intact. Moscow was roughly 400 kilometers away. The road was open. The German generals almost unanimously wanted to keep driving east. They argued that Moscow was not just the Soviet capital, but the center of the entire Soviet communications and rail network. Capturing it would sever the northern Soviet forces from the southern ones. It would produce an enormous propaganda blow. It would potentially end the war. General Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, was convinced that one more push would bring final victory. Hitler disagreed, and this is the decision that historians have argued about ever since. In late July and August 1941, Hitler issued a series of directives that fundamentally redirected the campaign. He ordered Army Group Center to halt its drive on Moscow. Guderian's Panzer Group was turned south to support Army Group South's drive into Ukraine. Army Group North was reinforced for the drive on Leningrad. The Moscow offensive was postponed. Hitler's reasoning was not irrational. He wanted the economic resources of Ukraine, the coal and iron of the Donbass, the grain fields of the south. He believed that cutting off the industrial and agricultural heartland of the Soviet Union would collapse the war economy faster than capturing the political capital. He also argued, with some military justification, that a drive on Moscow with exposed flanks would be dangerously vulnerable to Soviet counterattacks from the north and south. But his generals were furious. Guderian flew to Hitler's headquarters and argued for hours. Halder wrote in his diary that the decision was incomprehensible and might cost Germany the war. The debate raged through August. Hitler was immovable. The Ukraine operation went ahead, and by any military standard, it was a triumph. The encirclement at Kiev in September 1941 produced the largest single battle of encirclement in history, capturing more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers, destroying 4 entire Soviet armies and opening the entire southern Soviet Union to German advance. On paper, it looked like another masterpiece. In practice, it had cost Germany something it could never recover: time. The Moscow offensive, renamed Operation Typhoon, finally began on October 2, 1941. It was 6 weeks later than the generals had wanted. 6 weeks that, in Russia, was the difference between summer and winter. The offensive opened brilliantly. 2 more enormous encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk trapped another 660,000 Soviet soldiers. The road to Moscow seemed open once again. German motorcycle reconnaissance units could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. But the calendar was now the enemy. In early October, the autumn rains began and the Russian roads dissolved. The Germans called it the Rasputitsa, the season of mud. Tanks sank to their turrets. Trucks disappeared up to their axles. The entire German advance slowed to a crawl. Soldiers who had been moving 50 kilometers a day were now moving 50 kilometers a week. Supply columns broke down. Fuel ran short. Ammunition ran short. Food ran short. Then, in November, the mud froze. That sounds like relief, and for a few days it was. The ground hardened and the tanks could move again. Army Group Center made one last desperate push forward, reaching within 20 kilometers of Moscow in early December. Individual German patrols reported being able to see the city through field glasses. It was the closest they would ever get. Because what the German army did not have, and what the Soviet army did have, was winter equipment. German soldiers were fighting in their summer uniforms as temperatures dropped to -30 and -40 degrees Celsius. Their weapons jammed in the cold. Their tanks would not start in the morning. Their horses died by the thousands. Frostbite casualties began to outnumber combat casualties. Meanwhile, Stalin had received intelligence from his spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, confirming that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union in the east. This allowed him to transfer 25 full divisions from Siberia, battle-hardened soldiers equipped and trained for winter warfare. On December 5, 1941, 2 days before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war, the Soviets launched their first major counteroffensive. The German lines around Moscow buckled, then broke, then retreated in the worst crisis the Wehrmacht had faced since the war began. For a few terrible weeks in December 1941, it looked as though the German army in the east might collapse entirely. It did not collapse. Hitler, in one of the genuine military decisions for which he deserves partial credit, issued an order forbidding retreat and held the line through the winter by sheer force of will and terror. Generals who ordered withdrawals without permission were dismissed or court-martialed. The line was ugly, ragged, and improvised, but it held. By the spring of 1942, Germany still controlled vast territories of the Soviet Union, still had a functioning army, still had a chance, in theory, of winning. But the war was now fundamentally different from the war that had been planned. The knockout blow had not landed. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. Germany was now in a prolonged war of attrition against an enemy that had more men, more land, more resources, and, increasingly, more equipment. The 8-week campaign had become a years-long struggle that Germany could not win. 1942 would bring new German offensives, new dramatic advances, the drive to Stalingrad and the Caucasus. But none of it would recapture the strategic simplicity of what Barbarossa had promised. And at Stalingrad, in the winter of 1942 to 1943, the bill finally came due. The Sixth Army, the most powerful single force in the German order of battle, was surrounded by a Soviet counteroffensive of breathtaking skill and ambition, Operation Uranus, and was destroyed. 330,000 men went into the Stalingrad pocket. 90,000 came out as prisoners when the surrender came in February 1943. Of those 90,000, fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. After Stalingrad, the war in the East was lost. Germany would fight on for 2 more years, inflicting enormous casualties, defending every meter of territory with savage tenacity. But the outcome, after Stalingrad, was not in doubt. The question was only how many millions more would die before the end came. And it had all been set in motion on a single morning in June 1941, when 3 million men crossed a border that should never have been crossed. There is a conversation worth having here, and it concerns not just the military mistakes, but the nature of the decision itself. Hitler's generals, many of them writing their memoirs after the war in Allied captivity, were extremely keen to blame Hitler personally for every German failure in the East. They argued that they had wanted to drive on Moscow in the summer of 1941, and that Hitler's Ukraine diversion had cost them the campaign. They argued that his hold-fast orders in the winter of 1941 had turned what might have been an organized withdrawal into a desperate, bloody defense. They argued that his interference in military operations throughout 1942 and 1943 had squandered every advantage that German tactical skill and fighting quality could produce. There is real truth in all of these arguments. Hitler was not a trained military professional, and from 1942 onward, his interventions in operational matters became increasingly divorced from military reality. His insistence, for example, on holding Stalingrad long after a breakout was possible was a direct cause of the Sixth Army's destruction. But there is another side to this argument that the self-serving memoirs of German generals tend to leave out. It was not Hitler who planned the overall invasion. It was the German General Staff that produced the operational plans for Barbarossa. It was those same generals who told Hitler the campaign would take 8 to 10 weeks. It was their intelligence assessments that underestimated Soviet strength and industrial capacity so catastrophically. It was their logistical planning that sent 3 million men into Russia without adequate winter equipment. Because the planners genuinely believed the campaign would be over before winter arrived. The German army did not go into Russia with a plan for a long campaign. It went in with a plan for a short one, and when the short campaign failed, there was no plan B. The generals blamed Hitler for the failure. Hitler blamed the generals. The reality was that both were complicit in a collective act of strategic self-deception, the belief that one military hammer blow could shatter a state of 200 million people in 8 weeks. The human cost of this act of self-deception is almost beyond comprehension. By the time the war on the Eastern Front ended in May 1945, the Soviet Union had lost somewhere between 26 and 27 million people, military and civilian combined. Germany had lost more than 5 million soldiers on the Eastern Front alone, with another million taken prisoner. The countries of Eastern Europe, the Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, the Baltic states had been fought over, occupied, looted, and devastated in ways from which some regions would not recover for decades. 6 million European Jews had been murdered, most of them in the occupied Eastern territories, in the industrial killing apparatus that the Nazis built precisely because they believed those territories would remain permanently under German control. The scale of it is not something the human mind processes easily. It exists in a category of historical event that resists ordinary description. And at the root of all of it was a decision made by one man, sitting in a map room with his generals around him, who had talked himself into believing that the largest country on earth could be conquered before the leaves fell from the trees. The thing about Operation Barbarossa that historians return to again and again is not simply that it failed. Many military operations fail. What makes it unique is how completely it violated the most basic rules of strategic thinking that military planners had understood since ancient times. Do not fight a two-front war. Do not underestimate your enemy. Do not begin a campaign with objectives that require perfect execution at every level. Do not stake everything on a single throw of the dice when the consequences of losing are absolute. All of these rules existed. All of them had been proven by history, including by Napoleon's catastrophic Russian campaign of 1812, which Hitler's staff had studied in detail and from which they had drawn, with remarkable determination, almost entirely the wrong lessons. Napoleon had also believed Russia would fall quickly. Napoleon had also advanced too far, too fast, with supply lines that could not sustain his army. Napoleon had also found himself facing a winter for which he was not prepared. Napoleon had also watched his magnificent army dissolve in the Russian cold. Hitler knew all of this. His generals knew all of this. And they went anyway, because they believed, or told themselves they believed, that this time was different, that the Soviet Union was weaker than Napoleon's Russia, that German technology and tactics had created a form of warfare that would compress a campaign from months into weeks, that what had destroyed every previous invader of Russia would not destroy them. It is a very human kind of mistake. It is the mistake of people who have been successful for long enough that they have confused their own skill with the absence of limits. By June 1941, Hitler and his generals had won so many campaigns against so many enemies so quickly that failure had become, in some deep psychological sense, unimaginable to them. They had not encountered a problem that force of will and operational brilliance had not been able to solve. And so they did not plan for one. They planned for success, and they executed the plan with extraordinary skill. And the extraordinary skill was not enough, because the plan itself was built on a foundation of assumptions that the vastness of Russia, the stubbornness of the Soviet state, and the brutal arithmetic of the Eastern winter simply refused to honor. In the Wolf's Lair on the evening of June 22, 1941, as the first reports of German advances came in and the maps showed arrows driving deep into Soviet territory, Hitler is reported to have said that the world would hold its breath. He was right about that. The world held its breath and watched, and what it saw across the next 4 years was not the quick victory that had been promised, but the slow, grinding, catastrophic undoing of the most powerful military machine Europe had ever produced, broken against the enormous indifference of Russian space and the refusal of the Soviet state to die on schedule. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, when German representatives signed the unconditional surrender in a schoolroom in Reims, France, and again in Berlin. Hitler had been dead for 8 days, having shot himself in a bunker beneath the ruins of his capital as Soviet soldiers fought through the streets above him. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12. The living space he had promised the German people in the East had become instead the grave of German military power. of millions of German soldiers, and of whatever moral standing European civilization had accumulated over the preceding centuries. The decision to invade the Soviet Union did not just cost Hitler the war. It ended the world that had produced him. The last German soldier surrendered somewhere in the ruins of Berlin in May 1945. He was one of the survivors of an army that had crossed the Soviet border 4 years earlier, believing they would be home before Christmas. They were not home before Christmas. Many of them never came home at all. The ones who did come home years later from Soviet prisoner of war camps walked through streets that had been bombed flat and tried to explain to the people waiting for them what they had seen in the East. Most of them never fully managed it. Some things are too large to be put into words. Operation Barbarossa was one of them. That is the full story of the decision that cost Hitler the war. If you want to keep going deeper into the history of the Second World War, the video on screen now covers the fall of Berlin in 1945, the final days of the Reich, and what happened in that bunker at the end. Click it now.